My name is Rose. I'm 70 years old, and not long ago, I decided to start over. Not because life had given me all the answers, but because sometimes it pushes us to turn the page, even when our heart is still stuck in the paragraph before. After my kids grew up, after the noise in the house turned to silence, and the marriage became a memory, I packed my things, looked around, and moved. Far from the city where everything reminded me of who I used to be, and closer to a new beginning I wasn't even sure I wanted. I wasn't looking for anyone, not love, not company, not even a fresh start. All I wanted was peace, a quiet place of my own, a space where I could exist without having to explain. But what I didn't see coming is that life sometimes makes plans without asking for our permission. And just like that, on the porch of a new house, between a cup of tea and a wave across the street, it all began. Gently, quietly, with a glance that said more than 1,000 words. This isn't a story about youth. It's a story about presence, about truly seeing and being seen, about the kind of love that doesn't rush in, but gently draws near and stays, not in a hurry, but for good. If this story touched something in you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on the little bell. Here, every week, you'll find stories that warm the soul and remind us that it's never too late to live something beautiful. When I arrived at that house, with boxes piled up, the smell of fresh paint in the air, and a silence that felt far too old for a place so new, it was like stepping into a life that didn't quite feel like mine yet. I looked around, and everything was different. The smaller living room, the floor creaking in a tone I didn't know, the sunlight coming through the windows in a softer, more hesitant way. Even though I'd chosen that house carefully, signed the papers with confidence, there was a weight in my chest, as if parts of me had been left behind, forgotten on the old carpet, still hanging in the framed pictures that once held my children's smiles, hidden in the cupboards where so much life had been stored. It had been a long time since I'd felt new anywhere, and starting over at 70 felt like walking barefoot on unfamiliar ground. Those first nights were the hardest. The new mattress didn't seem to know me. The kitchen had unfamiliar sounds, and the old clock from the living room, the one I brought with me like a charm against emptiness, ticked too loudly, trying to fill a routine that didn't exist yet. I moved through the rooms carefully, like someone trying not to disturb the silence. And during one of those quiet walks, as I adjusted a curtain in the living room, I glanced for the first time at the house next door. It was simple, but there was beauty in the details. Flower pots in the window, a little iron chair in the front yard, white curtains dancing in the breeze. And then I saw him, a younger man, or maybe I should say, less old than me, pushing an older woman in a wheelchair across the porch. The way he tucked the blanket around her legs. There was a tenderness in it that stopped me. I stood there, watching longer than I should have. Not out of curiosity, but because something in that moment felt strangely familiar, like stumbling on a memory that wasn't mine, but still somehow belonged to me. In the days that followed, I found myself watching more often, not out of intrusion, but because that porch, that man, that rhythm became part of my world. Whenever I opened the window, there he was, sometimes watering the plants, sometimes reading beside his mother, sometimes just sitting quietly, sipping something and watching the sky. There was a calmness in him, a pace different from the world, and I, who had always kept to myself, created a small ritual, open the window, take a deep breath, and for a few minutes, just watch. It took me a while to understand what exactly kept me looking. Maybe it was the way he cared for his mother. Yes, I soon realized it was his mother. Or maybe it was the silent gesture of love still living in that simple routine. Watching them felt good. It kept me company, like opening a familiar book just to reread your favorite lines. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I was just trying to find my place after a lifetime of always belonging somewhere else. But that man reminded me, without ever saying a word, that the world could still surprise me. That even when we think everything has already happened, something new can still arrive. And it was in that space between what had ended and what might begin that everything started to shift. Quietly, slowly, just like all the truest things in life. It was just an ordinary afternoon, one of those that arrives quietly, with overcast skies and a gentle breeze. I had spent hours organizing boxes that still insisted on reminding me where I came from, photo frames I kept out of habit, books I hadn't opened in years, birthday cards that brought old voices back to life. After so much time digging through the past, I went to the kitchen and made some chamomile tea. And without thinking much, I took the cup with me to the front porch. The rocking chair was still getting used to my weight, and the wind felt cooler in that late afternoon light. That's when I heard the voice. "Good afternoon," he said, with a quiet but sincere smile, as he stepped out the front door of the house next door, carrying the elderly woman, his mother, in his arms. I looked up, a little startled. "Good afternoon," I replied, trying to sound casual. But there was something in the way he looked at me that caught me off guard. It wasn't the glance of a rushed neighbor. It was the kind of look that truly sees. And I, who had long since grown used to being invisible out in the world, felt that gaze like sunlight after rain. He walked toward the fence with calm, steady steps, gently rolling his mother's chair as she watched in silence. "My mom likes to sit out here in the evenings. I think the breeze helps her settle down," he said. I smiled, unsure of what to say, but not wanting to leave. "It's the kind of place that could settle the whole world if you let it," I replied. He laughed, and I did too. And in that shared laugh, brief as it was, something began. A kind of new lightness in the air, a beginning that didn't yet have a name. In the days that followed, the exchange continued. Small waves, short phrases, quiet smiles across the fence. I didn't ask much, and neither did he. It was as if we both understood that this beginning needed to be slow, soft-spoken. His mother would sometimes doze off in the chair, and other times she'd look at me with warmth and say things that didn't quite make sense. One day, she called me the lady from the garden. I smiled, and I didn't correct her, because deep down, that phrase felt strangely comforting. Then came the afternoon he walked over holding a cup. "I made too much tea. Would you like some?" he asked, extending a delicate porcelain mug. I laughed, surprised. Of course I would. And just like that, from two porches separated by a fence, we had tea. Him on his side, me on mine. But it felt like we were sitting at the same table. The conversation was light, about the weather, the neighborhood, how quiet the street was. His name was Daniel, and in that moment, his name carved out a place in my memory and in my day. When he went back home with the empty cup and a soft, "See you tomorrow," I stayed there a little longer. Alone, but somehow less alone than before. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I looked at that new house and thought, maybe, just maybe, I was starting to belong. There was something about the quiet moments between us that began to intrigue me. They weren't awkward, quite the opposite. They had a sort of warmth, like a soft blanket that covers without smothering. Every time we crossed paths, him stepping out with his mother, Me tending the garden, him watering the plants, me sweeping the sidewalk. There was a silent exchange, full of gentle smiles, lingering glances, a presence that recognized the other without knowing exactly why. And suddenly, the stretch of sidewalk between our homes became more than just a path. It became a bridge. My living room curtains became quiet accomplices. Sometimes I'd open them just enough to see if he was outside, not out of obsession, but out of a gentle longing for his presence. There were days he'd be gone for hours, and I noticed. That surprised me. How had someone who slipped into my routine so quietly already found a place in it? I didn't know. I just knew he had. And every time he reappeared, something inside me settled. I started noticing the little things. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking. The care he took to pull a blanket over his mother's shoulders when the wind picked up. The way he leaned in to hear her, even when her words came out jumbled. He was a young man, but there was an old soul in him. Someone who had loved deeply and maybe lost just as much. And I, who had always taken pride in being discreet, found myself more present, more aware, more alive. One afternoon, we were both out on our porches, each on our own side. His mother was napping, and the sky had turned a pale gray, promising soft rain. He looked in my direction and said, "I like cloudy days. I feel like they listen better than sunny ones." I smiled. It's because the world gets quieter when the sky closes in. He nodded, like he was tucking that thought into his pocket. And in that simple exchange, I felt something forming between us, a kind of invisible dance. Nothing had been said outright, but so much had already been said in its own way. It was that same day he asked for my name. "Rose," I said, almost laughing at the simplicity of it. "It suits you," he replied. And even though it was a casual comment, I felt my cheeks warm. It was the first time, in a very long time, that someone looked at me like that, really looked. Not through the lens of age or loneliness or assumption, just me, fully, clearly, seen. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, I felt something different. It wasn't excitement, it wasn't fear, just a gentle warmth in my chest, a quiet calm that wrapped itself around me. I didn't know what any of it meant. Maybe nothing. Maybe just a passing chapter in a season of change. But for the first time since I moved in, I wasn't just living there. I was belonging. A few days later, he showed up at my door. Literally. He knocked lightly with his knuckles and smiled as soon as I opened it. "My mom has a small cut on her hand. Would you happen to have one of those softer bandages?" The way he called me, ma'am, made me let out a quiet laugh. "I do," I said, already heading to the bathroom cabinet. I handed him the little box, and before he turned to leave, I asked, "Is she doing okay?" Instead of answering quickly, he leaned gently against the door frame and sighed. "She's more confused than usual today. Didn't even recognize my name." The silence that followed was heavy and soft at the same time. The kind of silence that only happens when someone understands your pain, without having to ask about it. That evening he didn't head straight home. He stayed there, on my porch, holding the box of bandages like it held a difficult memory. "She used to be such an active woman," he said, looking off into the distance. "Worked in schools, loved teaching. Now she spends her days asking where she left her students." I sat beside him. "And you?" I asked gently. "Who were you before all this?" He gave a half smile. "An architect. Still am, at least on paper." And then, as if something invisible had broken open, he began to share pieces of his life with me. His name was Daniel. He was 45. He had siblings who lived far away, and an ex-girlfriend who couldn't handle the weight of his mother's illness. Little by little, he gave up on projects, on travel, on weekends. He chose to stay, to care. And even though he never said it aloud, I could tell that choice was wearing him down. Not with regret, but with exhaustion. There was tiredness in his shoulders, but also a deep sense of dignity. I shared some of myself too. The marriage that ended in silence, the children who went on with their lives, the decision to sell my old house because it no longer felt like mine. When a house becomes bigger than we are, it's probably time to go, I said, and he nodded, like someone who understood more than he let on. There, between one story and the next, we laughed, at silly things, small things, light things, as if both our lives had cried enough, and now they were thirsty for joy. When it was time for him to go, he thanked me. For the bandage, and the conversation. And I, with a simple gesture, lightly touched his arm. Sometimes talking heals more than any bandage ever could. As I closed the door behind him, I felt something shift inside me. Like that brief moment had stitched up a part of me I'd forgotten was even torn. That night, I didn't rush to turn off the lights. I sat in the armchair by the window, looking out through the open curtain. Across the way, his house was still lit, and by the shadow on the wall, I could tell he was still awake. I thought about everything I'd heard, everything we'd said without really saying, and for the first time in a long while, I wished tomorrow would come quickly. After that exchange of stories, something changed in how I sat on my porch. The rocking chair, once just an old piece I'd stubbornly brought from my last house, became almost a meeting place with myself. I started coming outside more, watching more, breathing more slowly. The days still had long silences, but they were lighter now. Silences with company in them. I'd sit out there in the late afternoon with a book I didn't always read, with tea I didn't always drink, and let time pass, with a heart a little less tight and eyes a little more open to the world around me. Daniel seemed different too. He still followed the same careful routines, took the same quiet steps across the porch, cared for his mother with the same gentle hands. But there was a softness in him now. He looked at me longer. Sometimes he'd come to the fence just to comment on the weather. Other times he'd only wave with a quiet smile. There were no promises, no expectations, just a shared rhythm. Something almost invisible, beating in time with the breeze that passed between our homes. It was on a golden afternoon, the sky painted in orange and pink, that he surprised me with the simplest gesture. He appeared with 2 cups of tea, one for him, one for me, and sat on the porch steps, just on his side of the fence. "Thought it might be nice to share the sunset with someone," he said, almost like an apology. I just smiled and shifted a little on the bench, even though I knew he wouldn't cross over. And so we stayed there, each on our side, drinking tea, listening to the sounds of the evening, watching the sky slowly change. We didn't say much. He told me about an old design he'd once drawn for a public library. I told him about how I'm afraid to drive at night. We laughed at silly things, like how I still couldn't figure out how to adjust the water heater. At one point, his mother appeared in the doorway. Daniel stood up, went to her, spoke gently, and guided her back inside. When he returned, he apologized. "She gets restless in the evenings." I just nodded. "It's okay, we all do." And that simple comment seemed to reach something deep in him. That night, as I picked up the empty cup, I realized something had started to bloom. Not a feeling that had been spoken aloud, not a drawn-out intention, just a presence. The quiet sense that, even with lives so different, There was something in us that recognized each other. And maybe the porch, the dusk, the silence were just the way life found to place us face to face with what was still alive inside. It was only natural that over time my curiosity about his mother grew, not out of gossip, not out of unnecessary interest, but because somehow that fragile woman who spent her afternoons under the same sky as me began to feel familiar. Maybe it was the way she held the blanket over her knees, or the way her distant eyes still seemed to search for something in the world. Or maybe it was simply the fact that, in that house next door, there was a story that stretched across time, in a way I understood. It was late morning, after a sleepless night, when Daniel called out to me, his voice carrying a hint of panic. She fell. It was just a small fall, but she's shaken. Can you stay with her for a minute while I grab a few things from the car? Without thinking, I crossed the fence, for the first time. His house smelled like lavender and toasted bread. The living room felt warm and lived in, with stacked books, a plaid blanket on the couch, and old photos on the walls. His mother was seated, her eyes a little lost, her breathing short. When I approached, she looked at me and smiled. "You're the tea lady, aren't you?" she asked. I was moved. "Yes, I am." She nodded slowly, like someone recognizing an old memory. "I like how you smell," she said, and it undid me, completely. I sat beside her, gently held her hand, and said nothing. She didn't speak much after that, but the touch, the moment, held a tenderness that moved through every part of me. When Daniel returned, he found us there, hands held, as if we had always belonged to one another. From that day on, our connection deepened. I wasn't just the kind neighbor anymore. I became someone, present. Not constantly, not in any overbearing way, but available. For a quick chat, for a cup of tea in the evening, for a quiet moment holding his mother's hand while he stepped outside to catch his breath. And somewhere between soft words and gentle care, I realized how much that woman, even in her confusion, reminded me of myself. Because I had been lost once, too. I'd needed a hand to hold. I'd searched the world for something to remind me of who I was. And maybe, in a way I still don't fully understand, being with her helped me remember. Not the past, but the woman I could still become. After her fall, we began to see each other almost daily, not out of duty, but out of choice. Our presence in each other's lives started to feel natural, as if life itself was gently nudging us into a new season, one we hadn't planned for, but that arrived anyway, with the scent of change in the air. And strangely, I felt more alive than I had in years, not exactly happy, but warm, like a quiet heat slowly spreading through me, like I was learning to inhabit my whole self again. It was one afternoon, when he looked especially worn down, that something different happened. Daniel came onto the porch with a heavy expression, slouched shoulders, dark circles under his eyes. "Today was hard," he said plainly. I simply opened my arms. He sat beside me on the porch steps and stayed quiet for a long while, the kind of silence that hurts, because it holds everything there are no words for. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing inside her routine, like I stop being who I am and become just the caregiver, the responsible son. Sometimes I miss being seen." I took a deep breath, trying to hold back the wave rising in my chest. "I see you, Daniel," I said, meeting his eyes. "From the very first day, not just the man who cares, but the man who also needs care." He looked away for a moment, then back again, steadier this time. "Thank you. You have no idea how much those words mean." And in that moment, I knew. There was something between us that went beyond kindness, something real, raw, beautiful, alive. After that day, our moments together carried a new kind of ease. We were still in no rush, still without labels or expectations. But the glances lingered longer, the words came softer, and there were touches, brief and gentle, a brush of fingers while passing tea, a quick fix of a blanket, a shoulder that almost met another, and each small gesture held an entire world. I, who had spent so much time walking alone, realized I was already getting used to this presence beside me. And more than that, I liked being seen again, not as a mother, not as a widow, not as a kind older lady, but as a woman. That night, as I brushed my hair before bed, I looked at my reflection with more care. The wrinkles were still there. My eyes weren't as bright as they once were. But there was something new, a glow, a warmth, the memory of what it feels like to be looked at with tenderness. And I realized it wasn't vanity, it was gratitude. Gratitude for the paths that still remain, and for someone who could still hear me, even when I said nothing at all. Over time, the neighbors started to notice our closeness. It was inevitable. The neighborhood was quiet, the porches were close, and unspoken words always found a way to slip between the lines. First came the looks, then the comments, disguised as curiosity, and soon little phrases thrown out casually, said in that tone that isn't exactly judgment, but still carries poison. "You two seem to get along really well, don't you?" said a woman from across the street. "Nice to see that kind of friendship between generations." And she smiled with her lips, but not with her eyes. At first, I tried not to let it bother me. I smiled back, changed the subject, pretended not to notice. But something inside me began to shift. The age difference, which had never seemed to matter between us, started to feel more visible under the weight of other people's gazes. I began to question myself. Am I being ridiculous? Am I fooling myself? Does he see me as a woman, or just someone kind he can count on? Those doubts, the ones that had been asleep for days, returned like familiar ghosts. And with them came fear, the fear of crossing a line, of exposing myself too much, of confusing attention with affection, of projecting my longing for connection onto someone who might only see me with kindness. And that fear began to pull me away, little by little. Without even noticing, I started going out on the porch less, taking longer to reply to his messages, protecting myself with the same armor it had taken me years to build. Daniel, as perceptive as always, noticed. One day, he sent me a simple message. "Are you okay?" I hesitated for hours before answering. I wanted to say yes, that I was just tired. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It was the world trying to shrink me again. It was the old reflex of making myself smaller, just to fit into what others expected. And that made me sad, because I had lived too much to keep asking for permission to feel. One ordinary morning, I opened the window and saw Daniel on his porch, alone. No mother, no book, no coffee, just him, sitting, staring at the ground, as if something inside him had broken. And in that moment, I realized something. The distance I was creating wasn't just protecting me, it was hurting him. And maybe it was time to stop hiding behind shame, because what we had was real, it was honest, it was beautiful, and it deserved space to breathe. His mother was getting worse, her words more tangled, her days blurring together, her eyes wandering through places no one else could reach. And Daniel looked more and more worn down. He never complained, never asked for help. But it showed, in his eyes, in the deep circles beneath them, in the heaviness in his walk. And even though he didn't say a word, I knew he was at his limit. It was a cold morning. I was sweeping leaves from the porch when I saw him stumble slightly while helping his mother outside. I rushed to the gate. "Do you want me to stay with her for a bit while you rest?" He hesitated, but fatigue won over pride. "Would you really?" "Of course." And for the second time, I crossed the fence. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes downcast, her trembling hands resting in her lap. I walked toward her slowly, the way you move around something precious and fragile. "Good morning, Margaret." She looked at me with unfocused eyes for a few seconds. Then her face softened. "You came back," she whispered, and I smiled. I did. We sat together for almost an hour. I sang an old song my mother used to hum, read a few pages from a random book, held her hand while she slowly drifted to sleep against my shoulder. When Daniel came back, his face calmer, he stood at the door for a few seconds watching us quietly. "She always sleeps better when you're here," he said gently. "It's like your silence brings her peace." I didn't know what to say. I just looked at him with softness, because I felt it too. Like caring for her was, in some way, a reflection of the kind of care I longed to receive. Like each gesture was also healing something in me, something that had been hidden away for far too long. That afternoon, he walked me to the gate, and just before I left, he touched my arm gently. "You've meant more than you know." I smiled, moved. "So have you." And in that brief exchange, no big declarations, no promises or confessions, there was more truth than in many loves shouted from rooftops. The phone rang on a lazy late morning. It was Emily, my daughter. "Mom, I'm coming by this afternoon. Is that okay?" I tried to hide the flutter in my chest with a simple, "Of course, I'd love to see you." But I knew that visit, however brief, would bring more than hugs. Emily always had a kind of care that bordered on control. And lately, my missed Sunday video calls and my short, vague messages had clearly put her on alert. I made coffee and baked cornbread just like I used to when she was little. I tidied the living room carefully, even though I knew she'd notice the details. Daniel's book on the table, the extra cup by the sink, the clock on the wall stuck at the wrong time. When she arrived, with that firm hug and eyes that always saw more than they let on, I knew she was going to ask. Not directly, but still, she would. We chatted for a while about work, the kids, the city, and then, somewhere between sips of coffee, she casually asked, with a rehearsed kind of ease, "Who's the neighbor you've been spending so much time with?" I pretended to be surprised, but only for a second. "Daniel. He lives next door. He's been kind to me. That's all." She raised her eyebrows. "That's all?" I nodded. But inside, the unease began to grow. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Fear of being misunderstood, of something that felt beautiful to me, sounding strange to her. "He seems a lot younger, Mom." The words came gently, but they still stung. I took a deep breath. "He is. And even so, we've been spending time together. We take care of each other. No rush, no labels, just presence." She stayed quiet for a long time. Then she smiled. A small, uncertain smile. "I just want you to protect yourself. There are people who take advantage." I nodded calmly. "I know, but that's not the case. He's different." When she left, she hugged me tighter than usual. "You seem different too, more alive." And hearing that from her meant more than any verbal blessing ever could. I closed the door slowly after she left, and in the quiet that followed, I felt a strange kind of peace, because even without full acceptance, something new had appeared between us, a crack of understanding. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start changing everything. After Emily's visit, something in me closed off for a few days, not out of shame, but out of doubt. I found myself replaying all my moments with Daniel, the conversations, the glances, the light touches, the time we spent together. I started to wonder if I was imagining things, if it was just loneliness dressed up as connection, if he saw in me what I saw in him, or if it was all just in my head. And with those questions came distance, subtle but real. I started replying less, avoiding the porch when I knew he'd be there, saying I was tired when he invited me for tea. Daniel, as always, respected that. He didn't push, he didn't ask, but his eyes said what his mouth didn't. He noticed I was gone, and still, he didn't blame me. He waited, with that kind of patience that undid me more than any accusation ever could. In the quiet of my days, I began to sabotage myself. I thought about our differences, the age gap, the way the world would see us, the fact that even my own family didn't really understand. And the more I thought, the farther I drifted from the very thing that made me feel good. One night, while folding laundry without any hurry, I found a small note. It wasn't from him. It was mine, scribbled in one of my old notebooks, written with no intention of ever sending it, but it carried everything I wanted to say. Daniel, thank you for giving me back to myself, for seeing me without rushing, for listening, even to my silence. I don't know what this is between us, but I know it's been beautiful and real. Even if the world doesn't understand it, I do, and for now that's enough. I folded the paper and tucked it inside the book on my table. I didn't give it to him, but writing it freed me, because naming what we feel is sometimes more important than getting a response. And in that simple act, I reconnected with the truth of what was growing between us. The next day, I looked out the window and saw him sitting on the porch, alone, his shoulders slumped, his gaze low, and I felt, clearly, that my silence had hurt him too. But it wasn't too late. Not yet. And even when we lose our way for a while, when there's real affection, there's always a chance to find each other again. It was on a cool morning, after days of gray skies and heavy thoughts, that I decided to step outside. I grabbed a random broom, pretended to sweep away leaves that weren't there, and waited. Not out of pride, but because I needed him to see me. Again. And as if the universe had been listening, he appeared on his porch. Simple t-shirt, mug in hand, surprised eyes. Our eyes met. And in that instant, something gave way. The distance, the silence, the fear. He walked over slowly, like someone testing the water before diving in. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, that small kind of smile that says, "I'm sorry," without needing to speak. And he understood. "You disappeared," he said, not accusing, just noticing. "I got lost inside," I replied. We stood there side by side, leaning on the fence like two teenagers unsure how to restart a conversation left hanging. "I thought I'd done something wrong," he said. "You didn't. It was all in here," I said, pointing to my chest. "Sometimes the outside world shakes us more than we'd like." Daniel nodded. "I didn't want to pressure you. I just missed you." And those words, simple, honest, undid something in me. Because that was it. He wasn't demanding anything. He was just acknowledging the space I had left behind, like my place beside him had a name, and it mattered. "I missed you too," I admitted. And in saying that, it felt like an anchor had finally been released. I could breathe again. He invited me in for coffee. I didn't hesitate. I stepped into his house like someone returning from a long trip. Everything was the same, but somehow different. The light felt warmer, the couch more welcoming, the mug steadier in my hands. We talked for hours, as if the days of silence had been just a pause, not a break. And at the end, when he walked me to the gate, he looked at me with a new tenderness. "We can keep going from here, if you want to." And I, without needing to think, replied, "I do." In the days that followed, his presence returned to my daily life, but now with a steadier kind of softness. It wasn't just companionship, it was something shared. We began caring for his mother together now and then. I read to her. He cooked for us. In the evenings we'd sit in the garden, listening to the trees, letting the minutes pass as if time had no more urgency. And that's when I realized it wasn't about some idealized romance. It was about being, about staying, about slowly building whatever was possible with what life still had to offer. The neighbors began stopping by more often, and so did the comments. Some came as disguised compliments, others as sideways glances and loaded smiles. "It's nice seeing you two together," some would say. "But he's quite a bit younger, isn't he?" others would hint. I answered with a calm smile, because I no longer felt shame or fear. What we had didn't need to be explained, only lived. One day, while walking in the park, he reached for my hand without a second thought. And it wasn't exactly a romantic gesture. It was simply human, like someone saying, "I'm here," like something anchoring. And in that simple touch, I felt something pulse, the same something I'd buried years ago when I convinced myself there was no more room for new beginnings. But right there, in that park, with him, I understood something. Everything that truly matters is still possible, even when the world insists otherwise. That night, lying in bed, I thought about everything I'd lived through. The joys, the losses, the years where peace alone had felt enough. But now, something new was blooming. And it wasn't dependence. It was choice. I chose to be with him. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. And after all this time, that felt like the most beautiful way to love. It was a Saturday night. The kind of night when, years ago, the house would have been filled with voices, laughter, plates being passed around the table, grandchildren running back and forth. Now, the only sound came from the radio. Some old station playing even older songs, the kind that seem to know our story better than we do. And suddenly, The Way You Look Tonight started to play. And before I even noticed, a lump formed in my throat. That's when Daniel appeared, carrying a bag with 2 homemade meals. "Nothing fancy," he said, as if cooking with that kind of care were anything less than extraordinary. I invited him in. We had dinner in the living room, the lights dimmed, the radio still playing softly in the background. We didn't talk much. The food was too good for distractions, but our eyes said plenty. When the song changed, he looked at me with a gentle smile. "Do you like to dance?" he asked, as if stepping carefully onto delicate ground. I took a moment to answer. It had been years since I'd heard that question. "I used to. A lot," I whispered. And with a tenderness that made me tremble, he extended his hand. "Want to try?" I hesitated for half a second, but something inside me said yes, not in words, but in motion. I stood slowly, and right there, between the armchair and the coffee table, we started to dance. No technique, no rehearsed steps, just presence. The radio kept singing softly, and our timid steps seemed to remember something long tucked away in both of us. We danced through one song, then another, and when a slower tune began, Daniel pulled me just a little closer. I rested my head on his shoulder and closed my eyes. It felt like time had stopped. No age, no pain, no loss, just 2 bodies, finding a rhythm again. A dance that didn't need applause, only truth. Later, we sat in silence, my hands still warm from his, and my heart full. "It's been a long time since I danced with someone," I said. "It's been a long time since I danced with someone who looked at me like that," he replied. And in that moment, I understood that love doesn't arrive loudly. It whispers its way in, with slow steps, shy smiles, and old songs we'd almost forgotten how to sing. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the house was wrapped in that bluish twilight that comes just before the day. I made coffee, slipped on my favorite dress, and sat on the porch with a notebook in my lap. There was something inside me that needed to be written. Not a letter, not a diary, just the need to hold on to what was beginning before fear found time to erase it. As I wrote, Daniel appeared. He walked slowly, as if not wanting to interrupt. "I woke up missing you," he said. The words hit me with tenderness and a kind of quiet surprise. It had been so long since anyone had said that to me. I smiled. He sat on the porch step, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you miss being called by your name?" he asked without looking at me. "All the time," I said. "It's like after a while we stop being who we are and become just roles. Mom, Grandma, Ma'am." He nodded. "That's why I like saying your name, Rose." And then he said it again, like the word was sacred. That morning we talked about all the things that are rarely said, about how love may change its clothes, but it's still love, about how age doesn't cancel out desire, about the fear of looking foolish, and the greater fear of never being touched again. "Sometimes I feel like I've become invisible," I confessed. "But you're not," he said, meeting my eyes. "You never were." And in that moment, everything suspended between us fell gently, like autumn leaves. What was once doubt became clarity. What was hesitation became courage. Because there are things we need to hear, even when we already know them, even when we already feel them. And Daniel knew exactly how to say it. No drama, no promises, just presence. The morning went on quietly, but inside me, what once was silence turned into music. It happened on a night of soft rain, the kind of rain that doesn't scare, but doesn't go unnoticed either. The house was quiet, except for the ticking clock and the muffled sound of water on the roof. I was in the kitchen trying to find comfort in an old soup recipe when the phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was low, unsteady. "She's not doing well. I think she's leaving." Everything around me froze. I dropped the spoon on the counter and left. No time to fix my hair, no time to change clothes. I just went. Crossing the fence, the smell of wet earth wrapped around me like a quiet warning. The door was already ajar. I walked into his house without knocking. She was lying there, eyes closed, shallow breaths, her skin as thin as paper. Daniel sat beside her, his hands covering his face. I knelt down next to him and took his hand. "You're not alone." He didn't say anything, just nodded, eyes glassy, chest rising and falling with effort. We stayed like that for hours. Time stopped moving in straight lines. It was just presence, just waiting, just love in the shape of vigil. At some point, Margaret opened her eyes. She looked at me, then at him. And with the little strength she had left, she whispered, "Don't be afraid. Life goes on." Those were her last words. And even in the moment we knew she was gone, there was peace. Daniel cried, but it wasn't despair. It was a clean kind of grief, the kind that comes when you've loved someone all the way to the end, after the doctor came, after the rituals were done, After the body was taken away, it was just the two of us on the porch, the same porch where it had all begun. I sat beside him and rested my head on his shoulder. He held my hand. No words were spoken, but there was an understanding between us that only true love knows. That night, he stayed at my house, not out of desire, not on impulse, but out of a need for shelter. He fell asleep with his head in my lap, like a tired boy, and I sat there, gently running my fingers through his hair, whispering the prayers my mother once taught me. The night moved slowly, as if it knew we needed more time. The next morning I made coffee. He couldn't smile yet, but he looked at me with a kind of gratitude that said everything. And I knew something had changed in us, that shared grief is a kind of love, that caring for someone who's lost is also love. And from that day on, our stories were even more entwined. Later that same day, while sweeping the porch, I found something that made me stop. One of the flowers from his garden had landed at my doorstep. Small, simple, whole. I picked it up carefully and placed it in a glass of water, because some things, when they fall in the right place, bloom again. Months passed. The house next door has a new rhythm now, quieter, but also lighter. Daniel has returned to work, little by little. I help when I can, editing drafts, bringing tea during his breaks, reminding him to eat when he gets lost in blueprints and sketches. What we have doesn't have a name, and it doesn't need one. It doesn't fit into a definition. It's mature affection, a daily choice, mutual respect. Sometimes he sleeps here. Other times I sleep there. Sometimes we walk hand in hand through the park. Other times we sit in silence, listening to music on the radio. But always, we are together. My daughter doesn't ask so many questions anymore. She's accepted it, over time. She even smiles when she talks about him now. The neighbors are still neighbors. But I no longer carry their opinions with such weight, because I finally learned what others think doesn't define what is real. The rocking chair is still on my porch, but now, beside it, there's another chair. Daniel brought it one morning and said, "I thought it matched yours." And it did. Just like he matches me, not perfectly, but beautifully. And every morning before the sun fully rises, I open the living room window, that same window from the very first day, and I take a deep breath. Because life, even after all the pain, all the waiting, all the loss, still pulses, still surprises, still holds beauty. I'm 70 years old, and I never imagined I would live a love story so beautiful, so true, so completely mine. But I am living it, and every day, as the tea warms, as the rain falls, as the wind dances between the leaves, I give thanks for having had the courage to open the curtain, to look beside me, to see the other, and to allow myself to be seen. Because in the end, life only asks for this: an open window, a willing heart, and someone to hold your hand when the world feels like it might fall apart. And Daniel held mine, and I held his too, and we kept going, together.